When many people think about early American history, they imagine a vast empty wilderness waiting to be settled, but the reality is very different. Long before European ships appeared on the horizon, North America was home to millions of people living within thousands of communities, speaking hundreds of languages, maintaining sophisticated governments, and participating in extensive trade networks. The first chapter of America's genetic history does not begin in Europe. It begins here in America, with the indigenous peoples who shaped the continent for thousands of years before colonization. The ancestors of indigenous Americans arrived in the Americas during the late Ice Age. For much of the 20th century, historians promoted the idea of a single migration known as the Clovis First model. Modern archaeology and genetics have revealed a much more complex story. Human populations entered the Americas at least 15,000 years ago, and likely earlier, through a combination of routes that included Beringia, the land bridge that once connected Asia and North America, and possibly coastal migration routes along the Pacific. Over thousands of years, these populations spread throughout 2 continents and developed into hundreds of distinct nations with their own histories, languages, traditions, and genetic identities. One of the greatest misconceptions in popular history is the idea that North America was sparsely populated before European arrival. Population estimates vary because indigenous societies did not keep census records in the European sense, and devastating epidemics later destroyed many communities before they were documented. Most modern scholars estimate that millions of people lived in North America before 1492. These were not isolated bands scattered across an untouched wilderness. They were farmers, builders, traders, diplomats, artists, engineers, and political leaders. The landscape Europeans encountered was often one that had been shaped and managed by indigenous communities for thousands of years. There was never a single indigenous culture. The peoples of North America represented enormous diversity. In the Northeast, agricultural societies built villages and confederacies. In the Southeast, powerful chiefdoms controlled extensive territories and maintained ceremonial mound centers. The Southwest developed impressive stone and adobe communities adapted to desert environments. The Pacific Coast supported wealthy maritime societies based on fishing and trade. Every region developed unique cultures based upon local environments, histories, and relationships with neighboring nations. Many people are surprised to learn that North America had urban centers before European colonization. One of the greatest was Cahokia, located near present-day St. Louis. Around the year 1100, Cahokia may have contained between 10 and 20,000 residents, making it one of the largest urban centers north of Mexico at the time. Far to the southwest, the people of Chaco Canyon built monumental architecture, extensive roads, and ceremonial centers. These places reveal complex societies with specialized labor, engineering knowledge, political systems, and long-distance connections. Indigenous North America was connected by vast networks of trade and diplomacy. Materials traveled hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles. Copper from the Great Lakes appears far from its source. Marine shells from the Atlantic and Gulf coasts reached inland communities. Obsidian from western volcanic regions moved through extensive exchange networks. These connections spread not only goods but also ideas, technologies, artistic styles, and cultural practices. Long before European ships arrived, the Americas were already deeply interconnected. Indigenous societies developed sophisticated political systems. Among the most famous was the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, sometimes known as the Iroquois Confederacy, which united multiple nations through a complex system of diplomacy and governance. Across the continent, indigenous nations negotiated alliances, established territories, resolved conflicts, and maintained systems of law. European colonists did not enter an unclaimed land. They entered a political landscape filled with established nations. From a genetic genealogy perspective, indigenous Americans were never a single genetic group. Thousands of years of migration, isolation, adaptation, and interaction created tremendous diversity. Different communities developed their own genetic patterns, just as populations did in Europe, Africa, and Asia. This is why DNA testing can identify indigenous ancestry broadly, but often cannot determine a specific tribal affiliation without additional historical, documentary, and community evidence. Genetics tells us about biological relationships. Identity, citizenship, and belonging are determined by indigenous nations themselves. The genetic history of America was permanently transformed after European contact. Diseases such as smallpox, measles, and influenza spread among indigenous populations that had no prior exposure to these illnesses. Combined with warfare, forced migration, enslavement, and colonial expansion, these events caused dramatic population declines across many regions. This demographic collapse reshaped the genetic landscape of the Americas before many European settlers even began recording the communities they encountered. Understanding the true genetic history of early America requires us to start at the beginning. Before colonial records, before surnames, before immigration lists, there were already countless nations with ancient histories, complex societies, and deep ancestral connections to this land. For genealogists, this is an essential lesson. Every person living in America today carries a history shaped by migration, interaction, survival, and change. In the next episode, we will explore the arrival of Europeans, the many different populations who crossed the Atlantic, why they came, and how their genetics transformed the developing American population.